Welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. This week we're going to paint white flowers. We're going to try one or the other of either a white rose or a white gardenia, and I'm going to show you two different methods that you can use when you're painting white flowers. Now there are other methods too. These are just two that we can try out this week. You can do both, one at a time, or you can just do one of them. It's your choice. The photos are by Denise McQuillan, and I've really enjoyed using her work throughout this course. Beautiful photos, Denise, thank you. So get your paints, get a piece of paper, and we'll get started. So for our video today, we're going to explore two different ways to paint a white flower. Now, my white flowers have a dark background, and that is what makes the white stand out. If you're just painting a white flower on a white background, you'd need a different method. You'd need probably a lot more shadow, some outlining, a bit more grey, and we're not covering sort of that method here today. This is more the method where we have a lovely dark background to make the white glow. And I've taken these from two photos by Denise McQuillan. She's one of my favorites for photos for watercolor. So thank you, Denise, for your beautiful, beautiful photos. And the methods will be similar, but we're going to start off differently. And this one's a white gardenia here, and this one is a white rose. So I'm going to start with the white gardenia because I need to put a wash on there that I want to dry well. I'm talking about the other one and a few different things. So let's look at the sketch for the white gardenia first. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see pretty much the whole thing. And what I want to do with this one is wet all of the paper because I'm going to put a very light wash on first. Now, if you look at anything white or anything black for that matter, which are your not colors but your monotones, you're always going to see a variety of colors in the shadows and the highlights. Black can look almost light blue or light gray in the highlights, and white can look really, really dark sometimes in the shadows. So we want to put a variety of those things on this one first before we start with the detail and the paintings. Now, you can either look at your photograph and decide sort of what colors you see in the white, or you can go with a very generic formula that I quite often use. I learned this one years ago from a beautiful floral painter, and one of those things you're going to need is a yellow, lovely bright yellow, like a cadmium yellow. I have M. Graham's Azo Yellow, which is one of my favorites. It's more transparent than a cadmium yellow, and I'm trying to get away from the cadmiums, but that's that one. Now I love permanent rose. I use Winsor & Newton permanent rose, which is pretty much the same as a quinacridone rose. They use the same pigment as a quinacridone rose, but it's just a beautiful, cool rose color. It mixes so well. So you need those two colors for the sort of generic background. And then you're going to need a blue. And Cobalt Blue is a really soft blue. So I want to use Cobalt Blue for my background shadows in this white gardenia. Now, of course, we're going to put on a lot of green later. We don't have to worry about that right now. Now, just remember that yellow is one of your lightest colors, one of your most difficult colors to put on after anything else. So you need to start with yellow always. And I've got a number 10 brush, a bigger brush, and I've let this water soak in for a good minute and a half while I was talking to you. It needs to soak into the paper and wet the whole paper. If you don't have enough water on there, by a minute and a half it will have started to dry. So you really need to have a big mop brush or a big brush, and you need to go one way, then the other way, and then the other way again, and get your paper wet so the water can soak in. So I'm going to take my yellow, and I don't want to be too precise about where I put my yellow. I want to just put it here and there. It's kind of nice to have it off in the areas that will be green leaves because it will give some lovely yellow sparkle to the leaves. So think about that. and put it back there and a little bit in the center of the flower. Wash my brush and get my rose color. Now we don't want this rose to be too strong. Don't make a thick, deep rose. I'm just going to put that, even that's a little strong. I'm wiping a little bit off on my sponge. And I'm going to put a little bit of that rose here and there. Even in the green, don't be scared to put rose and red in your greens. Oh, it's a complementary colour and it just makes your greens look so vibrant rather than dull and dead. If your greens look dull and dead, you don't have enough yellow, red or rose in them. Now that little bit of blue, I don't want to overdo the blue. I see in my photo, I'm just turning my head to look at my photo, I see a little bit of shadow on this side of the flower. So I don't want to be too precise, but I do want to put a little bit of shadow in the right place. A little bit of that cobalt blue. Look how diluted, very diluted. And I can put a little bit in the shadows. And then I need to leave this alone. Please leave it alone. There's nothing worse than fiddling about, coming in with more paint, more water, more paint, more water. You just destroy what you've put on there. One stroke with a big brush and leave it alone. This is going to dry very, very light so that when you have all the darks on, you'll barely notice these light yellows and light pinks and light blues. So if you see right here, the blue, here's some yellow and here's some pink and lots of dark green in the background. This one needs to soak in. No hair dryers. It needs to fuse some. Look at these colors over here. The yellow and the pink and the blue are all fusing together. They're fusing together here. They're spreading into the water. And this is going to give the petals such a soft look. So put it to one side, put it somewhere else, and we will work on the white rose, which is different, just a different way to work, that's all. Neither one is right or wrong, just different. While we have this one here, I want to talk about value. And let me find my photograph. Now what I like to do is I like to print the photograph the same size as my painting so that I have something right in front of me to reference at all times. And this rose looked much better as a square. It just fitted the paper better. So this is 6 inches square. Now let's look at this photograph. The background is very, very dark. And I have something here, something really helpful called a value finder. Number one on value finders is the black, the blackest black. So that's value one. Now I have a book, and it's a good book on watercolor, and the author says that white is value one in her book. I think she has made a mistake, and I don't think publishers or anyone picked up on it, because every other book I have on drawing says that black is value one. And then you have all of the other values until you get to the whitest white, which on this scale, because there's 10 pieces on this scale, white is value 10, and then we have all of these ones in between. Now what's handy about this little tool, which was, I think it was like $2.50 in the art store, is you can match these little areas up to your paint. And I can see that the background here is almost like the black value one. Now if I bring the black over here, you can see how much lighter this is, and even here. So now I'm looking at value 2, which is almost black, and I'm seeing that the shadow in here into the rose is very close to that. And I can move this value finder around. Look right here, very close to value 3. Too dark for value 4, closer to this one. I move it around. Now if you don't want to go buy a value finder like that, you can make one. You can pick up a little piece of card from anywhere, like anything that you've got. It should be white card, not brown or anything else. White card, because you need to have the lightest value. Poke a hole in it, or cut a hole in it, or stamp a hole in it, or whatever, just a small hole. And then you can move this around. Sorry, I need to cough. And you can isolate areas that you think are white. Look, middle of the rose, we think it may be white, but if we isolate it, we see how really dark it is. This fold back petal here, and we can get an idea. This one, like almost pure white. And if you're doing a watercolor, you can accentuate. Like if something is almost white, you can make it pure white in your watercolor if you want to, just to accentuate the contrast. But then when we come over to this part of the flower, we see how very dark it is over here. Look at that. This is like the fold here. It's a purple color, but it's almost as dark as the black. We can't make it as dark as the black, and we might want to make it considerably lighter so that we have more of a contrast. Mine is definitely not as dark as my black, and I didn't want it to be. I don't want to go that dark, but I do want to have it so that it shows up. So if you're in any doubt, make yourself one of these. Cheap, free, and no expense spared for this excellent little tool to help you decide what your value is, because color can confuse you. You can see purple, but you may not see what value of purple you need here. So let's get back to I've lost my, here it is. Here's my rose that I have drawn. And we are going to just start with color on this one. We're not going to do a wash or anything like that. And I find if I'm painting something like this, the best place to start for me is right in the middle. And this is pretty dark right in the middle of this rose. So I want to go right into the middle there and make sure I get these little dark areas in first. Now you might say to me, well, but you just said work light to dark. That's kind of going against that principle. So you can always change your mind. The thing is, I am working sort of outwards on dry paper, so it's not as critical to work light to dark, although I will be doing the light areas and then the dark areas. So let's mix a color that is good for the center of this little rose here, and I have to just check my notes to see what I used. I used the two colors that I have here, the Azo Yellow and the Permanent Rose. And it doesn't matter if you go a little too light with your first layer, because you can come back and you can put some dark in. So I'm putting the two together. Might want to get a little bit more intense here. It's not a wash now. This is more color, so we're going to put the color on, and I will probably want to add a little bit of dark to this later. Let's zoom in again. And I have my reference photo and my other painting right in front of me, so that I've got something to look at all times, so I don't put something in the wrong place. And I want to have, this is going in here. And make sure your paper's nice and dry, because that will give you a lovely crisp edge. And it's too bright right now, but that's okay, because I'm going to come in when that's dry with a little bit of Cobalt Blue to just shadow that color down a little bit. That's called layering. Now I will add, I'm going to have another puddle here. Can't have too many puddles, you know. Another puddle here of that orangey, oops, you can't see, I'm sorry, that orangey color. And then I am going to add a little bit of blue to that orangey color to dull it down and make it into more of a browny orangey color. I don't want it brown, I don't want it too dull, but the blue will sort of make it a purpley brown. And right in the center of this rose here, right here, is a little dark area. That's in here. And it's very soft on the edges, this dark area. So to make stuff soft on the edges, wet brush, not too wet. I have a little sponge here. Look how ugly and dirty that sponge is. It's just paint. And I washed my brush, And then I just get off some of the moisture on the sponge. See, the sponge is wet, so it keeps my brush wet, but it takes off all the drips that are going to be too wet when I want to soften this edge here. You don't want it too wet. And that edge is very pink, but a soft, soft, gentle pink. So that means what I need here is I need a lot of water and a little bit of that permanent rose, so that I have just a pink wash for in here. Now I'm not going to connect all of these right now, because if I connect them, what happens is this wash runs into this wash, which runs into this wash, and then what I have is just one color that's the same everywhere. So I have to be careful not to connect them yet, and not to work too close. I just wanted to get this center in. The other thing I can do is this one here is still wet right here, and it's a little bit lighter. The light is kind of shining through just right here. So while it's still wet, I've got a thirsty brush, clean brush, dab it on my sponge, take a bit of water off, and just let's lift a little bit of that paint here, so it looks like the light is shining through the edge of that petal, and you still have the depth of color. Now it may look too dark against all of this white when you start. That's something that will make you want to go either too light or too dark. Don't worry about it, because as we get all of the other colors on, the dark background, this will look lighter and lighter as we add all of the other colors to what we're doing here. Now another color I want to have at the ready is I want to have a very soft lilac, and to make a soft lilac I need the permanent rose. Stick with the colors you're using, it will give lovely uniformity to your painting. So I'm going to make a violet with the permanent rose and the cobalt blue. Those are colors we're using. They make a beautiful, beautiful soft violet. I can modify that violet to make it more blue or more pink at any time, just by adding a little bit more of each color. And that's going to be a lovely shadow color for doing this rose. Let's have that ready. The nice thing is, working on dry paper, you can stop to mix color, you can stop to chat like I'm chatting. It's not, you're not worried about getting the wash on really quickly. Now this is all wet in the middle, so I want to work on this petal here, which is quite yellow, creamy yellow, and then it sort of comes up to white. So I've got too many brushes, too many choices here. I think my number 6 is a good one. So I just want yellow, just my Azo Yellow. Make sure it's well diluted, because I don't want it too strong. It's just very creamy looking. And most of the color is down here, away from the light. So I'm going to put a little tiny bit of the rose and yellow mix. Just pop it in there, just change it. Now, I want a clean brush now, so I'm cleaning my brush, wipe it on the sponge so it's not too wet, and then I'm going to just soften all of this with water. Now what that's going to do is it's going to draw the yellow up into the wet, but it will still stay darker down here where there's less light. And if you want to go back in a few seconds and add a little bit more color, take a little bit more of that orangey color called charging, while it's still wet, you can just tap a little bit of that color in there, and that charges the color in it, and it will start to flow up into the yellow too. But you have to kind of wait till there's, it's not too wet, otherwise you're going to get the whole thing will all turn the same color. So you have to have a lot of patience when you're doing watercolor. Otherwise, you're just going to get everything the same color. Now, over here on this petal, I want to move away from the wet petal now, and I want to work over here where it's nice and dry. This petal has more violet on it. So, and you can get a little dangerous with your color mixing too, because violet and yellow will make a gray color. I'm going to take a very diluted yellow, very, very diluted. I'm just going to paint it there. Now this is literally almost all water. I'm going to take water along here. Then I'm going to get a little bit of that violet that I mixed with my number 4 brush, so it's not too big a brush. And that violet I mixed is going to go in here where it's darker. And I want to use my wet brush to just soften it in to the yellow. Now, if I don't want to paint, I'm not painting over the yellow. I'm not painting the yellow into the violet. I just use my wet brush to merge the two very gently together. As the petal comes up here, it gets lighter again, and it has a little bit of a violet tinge on the outside. So put the violet tinge on the outside. We want to control this paint at all times, and then little wet brush to soften it. Now, of course, this is just one method. I mean, some people might just want to go wet and wet wild with their paint and have a very loose rose. That's really hard to do. Any of you that tried doing the cats loose and wet, you will know how hard it is to work with wet paint. Really hard. So it's better if we have a little bit of control here. Now there is quite a shadow right here, but I want to put that shadow on when this is dry, not when it's wet. So we can't do everything at once. We have to do a little bit at a time. But we can do this color down here. Now this is starting to dry, so we can put this part in, and this needs to be that lovely rose and yellow mix, that sort of orangey rose color. And it's actually quite nice to have the orangey rose color here. It does change on my photo. If you see my head move, I'm looking at the photo all the time, looking at the photo. It sort of changes to more yellow. So I started with the orangey rose, and then I'm getting the yellow on my brush for this side, and wet brush clean, put it on the sponge, and just use that wet brush to soften those two colors together. You can even lift a little while they're still wet. Don't lift too much, because you'll be surprised they'll dry almost white and you'll wonder where all your colour's gone. So I'm just dropping in a little bit more yellow there after I lift it a bit out. And we're slowly working inside the rose to the outside of the rose, not always touching wet paint to wet paint. That's why there's a lot of area here not painted, because I don't want to touch wet paint to wet paint. I'll come back and work on this area when other parts are drying, and I don't want to work on this dark area yet because it's scary. It's a lot of dark, so I want to kind of get my feel of how it's all working before I commit to a big dark area that's going to require quite a bit of skill. Also, I did this area in 3 layers, so it's not all at once get the dark petals on. You don't have to sort of worry about that. Another good area to work on is in here, right in here, we can put some shadow, and the shadow is sort of yellowy pink, and then it goes violet up under here. But I'm not going to do them all at once. I will do the yellowy pink first, let it dry, and then come back with some violets. So I'm going to start with the pinky color that I made with the yellow and the rose, and put that on first. Wet brush, soften it in. So many places on this rose have light coming through or light reflecting, so now I want to just get a little bit of the rose color, the permanent rose, because it's going to transition into violet when I put the shadow on. So you know what, rose underneath violet is a beautiful, beautiful combination, whereas yellow underneath violet will make grey. So if you want grey, put yellow under your violet. If you want more of a beautiful rosy violet colour, put rose under your violet, because the rose will come through and it will give your violet a beautiful look. Now this is pinky colour right now. It's not going to be pinky colour eventually. It's going to be more violet. And this in fact looks fairly grey, but I prefer, if I'm doing a painting, if the photo shows a sort of violety grey colour, I would rather go with a pinky violet than a violety grey, because you can add colour to a painting that you don't get in a photograph necessarily. And I like to add just a bit more colour. Up to you entirely, but I think you'll prefer your painting if it's a little bit more colourful and less grey, especially if it's a rose. Right, we've got a nice dry border here and a very light edge to this petal. So what I want to do with this petal is I want to wet it first. Now, up until now, we've been sort of putting colour on and then just blending it in with a wet brush, but this is a big area of colour and I want it to be a little bit more wet in wet, because otherwise you could end up with some very hard lines that won't look as nice in this soft, gentle rose. So just gently wetting just this area, and I always go to my bigger brushes for wetting. I'm going to get my diluted yellow and just put that on this side. Now in the photo, like, the rose looks almost perfectly white, and I promise you, once this yellow has dried, it will look almost white. You'll be hardly able to tell that it has yellow on it. Put a little bit of yellow here, it's a bit darker. Get my rose colour, and I'm going to put some under here. This is going to be a violet colour under here later when I put the shadow on. Put some rose colour here. And I'm just going to sort of streak in a little bit of rose and violet. Streak that in. And see what I mean? As I put these sort of streaks in, if I put those in on dry paper and try and brush them in, I might get some very harsh lines. So I want to be careful with that by doing some wet and wet. I've had a little bit of the violet. I'm just going to pop it under here. I will be putting more violet on later. While I have some violet, which is the cobalt blue and the rose colour, I have some. I am just going to do, I have to keep just modifying it until I just get it right. I could test it on a piece of paper, but sometimes it doesn't detract by putting a little bit on your painting, because you can add a little bit of colour here and there and it can be slightly different, and that's fine. I'm going to add just a little bit of dark violet while it's wet, because this is just fine to do that. We've got all this wet and wet. Pop it under here. And anytime you blend your paint in, don't get a wet brush. Don't wash your brush and come back with your brush loaded with water and drips. Wash your brush for sure, but then wipe it on a sponge or something. And here's a don't do. Here's a don't do. I see this all the time. Now, someone will wash their brush, which is really good, and then they get their towel and then they like squeeze and screw their brush in the towel, squeezing it and pulling on these poor hairs at the end of the brush, pulling them and twisting them, which is going to break them. Imagine if it's your hair and you were pulling it and twisting it, you're going to get split ends. Same with your brush. And they have, they get a lovely point that way, but their brush is dry by now. The hairs are all twisted and stressed, and they're going to have to wet it again to get any water on it. So a much better way to do it is to have a nice damp sponge, wash your brush, and just gently take off a few of those water droplets and excess water on your sponge, and then you'll have the perfect amount of water on your brush, and you won't have distressed or hurt or damaged your bristles in any way. Now this outside petal, this big outside petal, has a little yellow area here, which is rather beautiful, and I think I just want to put that yellow area, oops, don't put your hand in the wet paint either, I'm always doing that. I just want to put that yellow area in before I do anything else. So I just left that little bit to dry, and then I'm going to wet this petal just to put a little bit of the sort of purpley violet colour on there, wet on wet. I don't want it too strong, and anytime you put some wet background in, you can control how strong your colour is, and also you don't want hard lines. If you put a hard line on it, doesn't look like a soft petal. So there's a little bit of sort of curved shadow here. I added a little bit more blue to the violet. I'm bringing this curved shadow down that's just here, and it sort of comes up against that yellow, which is kind of nice. The yellow's dry now. I just left it to dry. And there's a little bit of pink just in this edge of the shadow. So I've got my rose and put that in there. And wet brush again, just soften that in. And you want to, when you have that violet colour, you want to sometimes have it a rosy violet and sometimes a more bluey violet. Now I've added a little bit more rose, probably too much. A little bit more violety rose blue here. Just take that along there, and I want to leave most of this white, just white paper. I don't want it to have too much colour in. I use my wet brush again to sort of mop that up a little bit. And the other place there's quite a strong shadow is over here, so I didn't wet it very much up here. Add a bit more blue to my violet so it's a much cooler shadow, and I'm going to put that over here, making sure, see, this petal here has a nice dry edge, so as I come along that edge of the petal, went over the edge a little bit and I shouldn't have done, I got a lovely sharp edge there against this petal. Now the key is to go slowly, because if you go slowly you have a lot of control, and you can just do it piece by piece, just this little bit and this little bit. I want this white on the edge because I'm going to have a dark background, so I want that lovely white edge to stand out. And on the photograph it's really, really dark here, and I may not be able to get it that dark at the moment. I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine to my violet that I'm making. Ultramarine is stronger than, I don't know if you can see here, the ultramarine makes a much stronger violet than the cobalt. It's a similar colour, but it's just a bit stronger. So I have mixed that up, and it is going to just go right here, just a strong colour here, and another bit just right here. Now I'm not really painting with my brush. I'm sort of putting the tip of my brush on the paper, and I'm just letting the paint kind of flow off of the tip of my brush into the wet paint that's already there. It's not really painting. It's called dropping in or charging. And at any time I want to soften that, I can take my brush and soften it a little bit. Let's put that over here. Now I'm gradually working towards this really dark edge that I said is pretty. It's a pretty sort of scary edge, so I don't want to go there yet. I'm aware that this is all kind of against some wet here, so I want to do that. I'm thinking right here, it's quite yellowy in here, and we'll do it in 2 layers. We'll put a yellowy layer first, and then I'll come back with a more browny yellow layer. Now what happened here was I didn't wet carefully with a Kleenex. I didn't wet this very carefully, so I have gone over my yellow, so I want to clean that up before I do anything else. Wet brush, Kleenex, and just clean up that area that I didn't wet very well. I also went over the edge here where I shouldn't have, so I can just dab with a Kleenex and clean that up. That's what I mean, you have to go slow and carefully. Now I want to put in here some yellow, so first I'm just going to wet that edge a little bit so I've got a soft edge to the yellow, and I want white above, and then we'll get the yellow, and just yellow by itself to start with, because I think I'll do a second layer where I use a more browny yellow. I'll use the blue and the rose and maybe even a little bit of burnt sienna to make the yellow browner for the second layer. And I want to get a little bit of the orange mix, which is the yellow and the rose, and I just want to change the color up to that more orangey mix here as it comes across here. So it comes across in a diagonal. Remember, I wet this bit so I can kind of scoop my brush along it and soften it with my brush as I scoop it along there. And like I said, down here in the hollow is going to be much darker. We want to get a little bit of that color on first. And also we have this part here is nice and dry, so I can put in a lovely sort of rosy shadow in here. Now I am not going to soften this shadow. I'm going to put it in hard edged so that I have just 1 or 2 little hard edges here and there. And I'm just looking around. I want more rosy colored. I'm adding a little bit more rose, more rosy colored shadow is going to be, I've got that one here. I've got to look back and forth, see what I've got. Okay, we've got to have this one in here, more rosy color. Put the paint in, wet brush, soften it up. Make sure it goes to white in some places, because you definitely want to have some white showing. I'm just softening that, and tiny bit of really diluted yellow just here, kind of glowing through here. Now of course, you know, when we did the background wash for this one, all that kind of yellow and rose and stuff was all just put in wet, any old where. But with this one, we're controlling where all of that goes. Just a different method of painting, that's all. It's not one or the other. It doesn't have to be one that you do all the time, or this is the way to do it. It's just different methods, that's all. So I'm getting to the point now where I'm gonna have to do the darker one sooner or later. It's got to be done. So I'm just looking around for what else can I do before I move on to that really dark one. And of course the dark one's not going to go dark in one layer. It's going to have 2 or 3 layers, so I can put some pink and I can put some light lilac on and different things. Well, what I do want to do, this rose is dry here, so I want to have some color on this folded back petal here, and it's quite rosy. So I'm going to take the rose and put that on here on this side, and it's, you know, things transition from quite light in some places to quite dark in others. So I'm going to put the rose on first, and then I'm going to get the lilac, and I am going to do this one kind of wet in wet, so the rose and the lilac kind of blend together. And I want a little bit of white. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got too far over here. I've got to keep an eye on what I'm doing. I'm too engrossed in my painting. I am so sorry. There we go. Move it up so you can see it. You're probably just shouting at me, aren't you? Move your piece of paper. I can't see. I'm sorry. So I want the lilac and the rose to kind of blend wet in wet and nice and softly, but I want a little strip of white that I've left dry just along this edge, and a little bit of white just at the edge over here, because we're going to have quite a lot of dark coming up against that white, and it's going to be lovely and dramatic, beautifully dramatic. So I'm going to move it down again. Don't panic. I'm keeping an eye on what I'm doing here. I just have to get the right brush. My number 8, my trusty number 8. It's such a good little brush. Now, there is a sort of a fold in the petal around about here, and it's quite a strong fold. So I want to work on this side of the fold first, putting in the soft lilac on that side. Add a little bit more cobalt. So there's a really soft lilac shadow coming up to this fold and kind of curving around the petal like this. Now I have a hard edge right now, just starting with a hard edge, and come down to this dry edge, but I want to soften some of this definitely. So wash my brush on my sponge, control the water, soften just here, soften just here, and leave a little bit of hard edge up there, and it to this, just being careful right to here, and leave that for a moment. And then there's another little part comes out just here, and it's going to get quite dark, but we're not going to go dark all at once. There's some lovely rosy colour under there. Let's take rose to the edge here, and rose out to the edge here. You have to kind of think, you have to think what's underneath there, because you're putting in the underneath colours right now. So I want, under my lilac that I will have on top, I want some rose glowing through. So I can't go that dark yet. I'm putting in that glow. There's a little bit of light glow. Oh, again, see, I've got to push my painting up. A little bit of light glow here. I'm just taking this up here. A little bit of thirsty brush. And we've got this quite hard one here. And just here, a little bit of a light glow here. Take those back. Oh, slowly, slowly, it's coming together. Well, now that it's time for the background, you need to go really, really dark with the background and nice and transparent. Otherwise, your rose is going to look more like a purple rose as it does at the moment. Now, that's fine. If you don't want to do the dark background and you like your rose like this, just leave it like this and be happy with what you've got. Or maybe don't go quite as dark with the shadows to keep your rose really white looking. But when we put some really, really dark shadows in the background, you will notice that the rose will look much whiter. So we can do this in 2 layers or 1 layer. And sometimes you can't get the first layer dark enough because it's quite difficult to get a very dark color. Now I'm using artist pigments, so they have a lot more pigment in them, which makes it a little bit easier to get a dark color. And you don't want a small brush. I'm going to start with my number 8 because I want some control, but I don't want to be, you know, too fiddly with my brushwork. It's got to go on fairly quickly. Now, a really good transparent dark is the Phthalo Green. It's a very intense color. Most of these are staining colors, so you can't lift them once you get them on there. They're on there, but that makes them really good for dark colors and good for layering, because if you dry this layer and then put another layer on, you're not going to lift this dark layer underneath. So I'm going to start with Phthalo Green, and I also have Prussian Blue, which is a really lovely transparent dark blue. And of course you could use Ultramarine Blue, but Ultramarine Blue granulates. So if you're doing a big wet wash like this, it can granulate on you, and that gives you a lovely texture in the background, but it doesn't always give you the lovely clear background that you want. So I've got my Prussian Blue. Notice how much pigment I'm adding. I'm chatting to you and adding pigment, adding a little bit more water. I don't want this to be a dry mix at all. I want it to flow onto my paper really easily. I'm going to use the Dioxazine Violet, or D Violet for short because it's such a long word. And once I add that violet in, it's getting really really dark. A little bit more violet. And of course you can do this like I said in 2 layers if you want to. And if you don't have Prussian Blue, you can use Ultramarine Blue. Just be aware that it might granulate a bit, but that's not, you know, that's not a really, really bad thing. That's okay. Bit more violet. Now, I think I'm ready to go. And the nice thing is this painting doesn't have great big areas of dark. It has smaller areas, so I'm not going to have to rush so much. It's better to start with a very small area, and it's better to turn your board so you can paint without getting your wrist in it, with control. And use the point of your brush. You know, last week we did a background around the hawk, and I showed you how to mix this lovely dark color and go with 1 layer. Use the point of your brush very, very carefully to go around the sharp edges of the leaves and the stem. And then you can quickly, not too quickly, you don't want to be careless, but fairly quickly, sort of quickly, but not too quickly, not carelessly quickly, you know, push your brush down and get the rest of the background on as quickly as you can. Do not go back over your brush strokes. Now see this little corner here? I think I might switch to my number 4 brush just to get in here. Now this is where the lovely soft absorbent brushes are great, because they hold a lot of paint, which means you can get those washes on really easily because your brush is just absolutely full of paint. I'm going to switch back to my number 8 now that I have that little piece in, and go very carefully up against the edge of my rose. Dip into your paint often. Don't leave it. Okay, so what just happened was the worst thing that can happen to a watercolorist is I had a Christmas delivery come to the door, which I had to go get, so I had to stop And now I am going to get a dry line right here where I had to stop. And as this is just a demo, I'm not too broken up about it, but if it was a painting that I was doing as a commission or for sale, I would have ignored the doorbell and kept going with the wash, because it is just vital that you get this wash on in one go with no edges drying. And that's why you have to keep dipping your brush in, so that you've got lots of paint on your brush and you don't run out of lovely wet pigment rich paint. And you can't have it, you can't vary the wetness, you can't put water, extra water in it once you started, which is why I'm going to get a line where I stopped when I had a delivery. So be aware of that. If you have to, if somebody wants you, if your phone rings, if you have to stop, try to stop somewhere where you're not going to notice that line happening, because as soon as you come back and put wet paint onto paint that's starting to dry, you're going to get a big line or a back run or something ugly happening to your wash. Now I'm dipping back into my paint it's probably 3 brush strokes, and I got a big blob on there. I'm going to grab a Kleenex. Try and have a Kleenex handy. Sorry for reaching over you like that. And you'll notice I keep turning the board so that I can easily get into these little areas with the tip of my brush, and I don't smudge with my wrist while I'm doing it. So I need to be able to have my wrist laying on the table so that I can control my hand. So if any of you have trouble, with shaky hands or having control, make sure you lay your wrist right down on the table so that you've got complete control of your hand. Your wrist it shouldn't be up in the air, making it difficult to hold your brush. So I keep making sure I get loads of pigment. You want to just go under that little bit just there with a little bit of shadow, just to get some. See that leaf there? It's very dark. I can put a little bit more shadow on with this dark wash, and I've managed to get it all on in one go without going back over my brush strokes. Please don't go back over your brush strokes. Don't go back with water to try and dilute them or anything like that. One brush stroke, big brush, lots of pigment, nice wet wash. And I think I had to stop here to go answer the door, and I was down there for about 5 minutes, and because my wash is really nice and wet, I think I might have got away with it. I think I can see it, but I don't think anybody else is going to be able to see it. And that's why it's good to start with these little areas where it's not going to notice if you have to stop for some reason. It's much harder with a big piece of paper. This is a nice small piece of paper. Make sure that your rose is completely dry before you do the background wash, or you're going to get bleeding happening. And make sure that you have it taped down, otherwise it's really going to buckle. With a wash this wet, you're going to get your paper all wavy and buckling. And with this little small one like this is 6 inches by 6 inches. I don't do all the stretching beforehand, but if you want one for framing or keeping, I suggest you do stretch beforehand, because it keeps your paper absolutely flat. And if you're putting a big wash on like this, the paper can buckle, and then your wash will dry unevenly. Your wash will dry darker in the deep hollows where the paper goes down, and lighter where it lifts up, and you'll get maybe runs, and that's why it's a really good thing to stretch your paper. But this is a little demo. It's just 6 by 6, so I didn't bother. I just put my tape on, and I'll keep my tape on until it's perfectly dry, and then I'll remove it. Now the second one we will move on to. We'll do the one where we did the background first, and that's been sitting there drying and getting ready for the next step. I'll make sure I've got it up the right way. I think I've got it upside down. Let me put it. Doesn't really matter, but it's good if I'm looking at the reference photo. I want to make sure that I'm working in the right direction. So we're going to firm that down. And again, this is going to be painted pretty much in the exact same way as the rose now. You know, going petal by petal, putting on a little bit of shadow and a little bit more color. It's the background that's going to be quite challenging because we're going to do some negative painting. And negative painting means we're going to do all of the light leaves first, and then we're going to paint behind them with a darker wash. So I'm going to go ahead and just be quiet while you watch me paint, because if I have to speed, you know, the painting part up. If I was to paint this in real time, a lot of it, this video is going to be 4 or 5 hours long. It's going to be way too long. So some of it I have to speed up so we can get it all in. And then some of it I will stop and I'll explain what I'm doing. So we're going to work on this one quietly, and I'll try and put the colors up on the screen that I'm using, but I'm using quite a variety of mixes. You know, when I have my little palette, I have all the colors I'm using all over the place, and I mix them as I go, and I modify them a little bit. If you want to get a sort of a darker pink, you add a little bit of green or a little bit of blue. If you want a sort of darker orange, you add a little bit of blue, and that's how you change your colors up. Now the process for adding the darks is really similar to the white rose. I'm going to use, for this dark background, I'm going to use ultramarine rather than the really deep background that I used for the white rose, but you can still use the deep mixture like the violet and the Prussian blue mixture for this one if you wanted to. The other thing is, when I have the darks on, I'm probably going to find that some of these shadows are too light, so I'll be going over them with a little bit more dark to intensify the shadows, and especially just the center of the flower, because you want your eye drawn to the center of the flower. I need to put maybe a little bit more dark there, but I want to get the dark on the background first, and I'll do that exactly the same as the white rose, carefully working around the leaves and maybe adding a little bit more shadow to the leaves. So the leaves should really fade into the background with just a little bit of detail, and that will make the gardenia look much brighter as we get the dark in the background. Now we're not done with all of the shadow yet. There still has to be quite a bit of shading on this leaf and a little bit on this leaf, and then some of the extra shadows on some of the others. And this petal here needs some grey shading on it as well. It's very much in the shade. So still a little bit of shading to do. Every layer needs to be dry before you work on the next layer of shading, especially on these background leaves. So we've got just a little bit more to do on those, a bit of shading on here, a little bit more to some of these shadows and the center of the flower. Now what I did mix up in the end was the Sap Green that I was using with a lot of Ultramarine Blue, and then I added a little bit of Permanent Rose to just make it a little bit more purple, a little bit more brown. Adding the complement to a colour really gives it some depth, and it makes it darker without having to add more and more of the colour, which just sort of washes it out. It's a much more vibrant way to go dark. So that's what I used, and I will continue to use for the darks in this big leaf here and some darks on this one here, but I need this layer to dry. So I'm going to work on the little tiny bits of shadow on the gardenia. Sorry, this is a gardenia, just to punch it up a little bit more. So what you can see me doing is a little bit of lifting, because when you put these colours like Ultramarine Blue and Sap Green on, they're easy colours to lift off, and we've put the Sap Green and the yellow on first so that they're underneath the darker layer that we've added the Ultramarine Blue and the little bit of rose to. So to get those lovely soft sort of highlights on the leaves, you can put the dark colour on, and then you can go back when it's dry with a wet brush and a Kleenex, and you can just, you know, lift out a few of those highlights, and it makes a much rounder, softer highlight than just trying to paint in that highlight with your brush. Up here I haven't finished this leaf. It has a bit of a fold over the other leaf, and I still have to do a little bit of work on that, and I want to lift out a little bit of the highlight here on the leaf. And that is one of the reasons I love Ultramarine Blue as a mixing colour, because it lifts so well, and you can do a lot of work after the painting work to sort of model your leaves and petals and so forth. Now there's not a lot more to do to this one. Now you can see with the dark background and the light sort of showing through on some of the leaves and a little bit of the lifting, you've got quite a 3D effect to the greenery, and all of those darks really make the white gardenia pop. And you may have seen that I added just a little bit, I had a little bit of cerulean mixed with the cobalt and very light, and I just added a little bit of shadow to the edges of the petals there. You can still see my pencil lines on the flower. I don't mind that look, but once you've put the paint on the pencil lines, you really can't erase them. So if you don't like that look, it's best to erase most of your pencil lines before you start. And that sounds counterintuitive, but I do mean most. You know, you kind of just erase them till you can barely see them, and then as soon as you put paint on them, they're permanent. But I don't mind them showing. I think it's fine. And usually when you have all this other detail, nobody really notices that your pencil lines are showing. Now, I have not gone as dark as the photo, because photos are often unnaturally dark. So I have kept it a little bit lighter, because I want my flower to look a little bit more bright and light and airy and watercolory. So I don't need to do the exact values of the photograph. I just need to follow them fairly closely. So this one is almost finished. I just have a little bit more to do on this this kind of curly leaf here, and I need it to be dry to do that. But I also like to just let you look at what it looks like when we get this ugly green tape off. Now this one is a 5x7. The rose was a 6x6. And I've used 140 pound Arch cold press paper for this, and I just put it on a bit of a neutral background there. So there we go, there's that one, and I think the rose is just about dry. Now you really do need to make sure that your background is beautifully dry, or your paper will warp and bubble up as it dries. Unfettered by the tape, it will sometimes dry unevenly. Now I have a little bit of pencil line going off under my tape here. So as that pencil line has no paint on it, sorry about the camera wobble, that will come off quite easily as long as it doesn't have paint on. There we have the two white flowers, two slightly different methods, same colours pretty much. We've used the same colours, the rose, the Azo, bright yellow, cadmium yellow, permanent yellow, one of those yellows. The permanent rose is a beautiful colour to use for these flowers and for gentle backgrounds. Cobalt Blue gives you some lovely gentle violets, and we've also used Sap Green for the greenery and some Ultramarine Blue to get the shadows darker, a little bit of Dioxazine Violet when we need some stronger violets, especially on the rose. And the backgrounds, I used some Prussian Blue, Dioxazine Violet, and a little bit of Phthalo Green in this background here, though you can barely see the Phthalo Green. It just gives it that dark intensity. So I hope you enjoyed doing your white flowers. I hope you took it slowly, because that's the important thing, to let it dry between layers. And I just need to do a little bit more work on this one, and then we're done. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you after Christmas. I hope your white flower or flowers turned out really well. If they didn't, just try again. It's just paper. Sometimes I have to try a few times before I get it right, even after a few years of painting. So don't lose heart, and see you next time. Bye for now.